Truth and Reconciliation started around COVID, during the pandemic, when Nilima and a few other partners started this as a series of dialogues around healing and leading. And this is the 5th year of Truth and Reconciliation dialogues. And this year is also very different from other years because it is focused especially on curating dialogues around decolonization. So all the sessions that we've done so far have been around decolonization, particularly of different things. We spoke about decolonizing tourism, for example, right? Or similarly, right now we're talking about decolonizing mental health. We spoke about we will probably also be speaking about how do we decolonize yoga in one of the upcoming sessions. So there is, I think colonization has become a very integral part of our day-to-day lives without us even realizing it. It is very it's a very subconsciously present bias that we live with every day. So I think this comes at a very good time and a very important time for us to be having this conversation. So yes, looking forward to this conversation and to also tell our viewers and people who've attended a little bit about Gitika, who's joined us today. Very, very grateful to you, first of all. And Gitika is a community clinical psychologist. She traveled to US as a student, as an international student, and a lot of her experiences that she'll be sharing today have also been formed as a result of that. She's done her PhD from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and she's also now started an organization called the Pranh Healing and Wellness, PLLC, which is a mental health organization creating and supporting people in harmonizing mind, body, spirit through individual and peer communities. And all the work that she also does at Prana is grounded in decolonial liberatory practices. Gitika has been committed to decolonization of mental health practices, beginning with disrupting the cultural appropriation of ancestral wisdom. She served on Dr. Thema Bryant's APA Presidential Taskforce on Decolonial and Liberation Psychologies. Having served immigrant communities as a therapist and a bipartisan immigration activist, Gitika is attentive to the historic backdrop to the immigration experience with the settler colony, now known as the United States. So therefore, our topic today is also focused on decolonizing mental health practices and more specifically for the immigrant community, right? So is there anything that I missed, Gitika, from your introduction?
No, I think that was great. Thank you.
Okay. So I think we'd like to start today's discussion by, even understanding your journey from India to the US. How were your experiences in the US shaped as a result of your growing up, your background and conditioning in a post-colonial India? How did that influence your perspectives and interactions in a completely new cultural setting? And how did these influence sort of manifest in your personal life, in your professional life when you first went to the US?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and welcome everyone. Whether you're here in the Zoom room or watching this recording later, I do invite all of us to also just connect with our bodies and our breathing, because a lot of what I'm about to share, and thanks to Pawani, your questions as well. They're also very heartfelt questions because Pawani and I have actually had some conversations before. So I really invite you to listen from the heart, even as I'm using language to communicate. So I think to even recognize my journey to the US, I would first want to name that there are many people, ancestors, teachers, and future generations that influence this moment for me. as I reflect on crossing the oceans to go study in the US and what that would end up meaning for me in my personal journey as someone who is the third generation survivor of partition of the countries now known as India and Pakistan. And my ancestors came from the border of what is present day Afghanistan and Pakistan, and then they migrated to what is called present day India. So there was migration in our family's history, and how much that would continue to manifest, I am coming to realize now. So it is not as though I went knowing how all of this is influenced me. I wasn't like, my family's migrated before and now I'll go to US. It's not like that. It's a very non-linear process. So to share the story of my migration, I would first like to share the story of the experience of um, in graduate school, when I was working, as part of my training, I was required to practice in different clinical mental health settings. And I worked with folks who were asylum seekers in the United States. They were seeking asylum because they were fleeing countries due to war, persecution. I was getting to also work with refugees, and I was also getting to work with, as part of my research work, I was getting to interact with a lot of people who migrated from Afghanistan to the US against the backdrop of 40 years of war, because Afghanistan had had so much happen in those years, in those multiple decades. So I was feeling very aware of how I, as a person who chose to migrate from India to the US by choice for a better, for training purposes, that I knew I really wanted to study mental health. And I also knew that I really wanted to study in a field called community psychology, because it was such a revolutionary field. It was questioning a lot of like the colonial paradigms of mental health, of clinical psychology. So I knew I was coming to the US to study, but I had made that choice. I wasn't forced by circumstances. So I was feeling very aware of like, I was grateful for the resources and privilege that I had, that I was able to migrate by choice, and that if I wished, I could return to India once. And my plan had always been that once I finish my PhD, I'm going to go back to India, because there was a very intentional things I wanted to do, and that is why I had gone to study community psychology. So I think there was just this awareness of how much respect I had for these different cultures that were represented by the people I was working with. And, that constant humbling awareness that all these countries that I was hearing about were so much more than their wars. Afghanistan is so much more than its, whatever you might see in the papers and stuff. So I think I was just very feeling very aware of all this. And then after I graduated, I worked in an organization called Cowlitz Mental Health and Cowlitz Tribal Health. And I was working with this organization that was essentially an indigenous tribe, what commonly is known as a Native American tribe. But I'm very intentional about using the phrase indigenous tribe, and I might or might not come to that later. But so I was working with Cowlitz tribe, and that is when for the first time, after working with a lot of trauma survivors, it was working at Cowlitz tribe that I, for the first time, experienced survivor guilt. And I named that very particularly because it was working with Cowlitz tribe that it really came home to me that Columbus had gone looking for a country called India. And there were people living on this land long before Columbus got there, who he mistook for Indians. And then there was this entire cycle of genocide. And it was working with the tribe that it first really came home to me that the United States is a colony. It's a settler colonial nation. It had many indigenous tribes, many more than are recognized today. There are like less than 600 recognized tribes, but there are many more tribes than the ones that are officially recognized in what is called the United States. And I was like, people were exterminated, but it all started first by the search for my people. And I remember then realizing, could this have been our history? So I remembered like sitting with that. What does it mean to be an Indian in a settler colony called the United States? And the tribes there now claim the term Indian nation. And that has been a very important journey as well. And I had to, as I work with the tribe, I had to also recognize that there was great meaning and sacredness to us sharing a name. I was Indian from South Asia, and they were Indian of Turtle Island. And my journey in the United States has been very influenced, not only by the flight I took from India to the United States, but it's influenced by the journey I made within as I recognized land ancestors on Turtle Island, that there were people who stewarded this land long before I got there. And then there were indigenous ancestors from African nations who were forced onto Turtle Island through slavery. And those indigenous ancestors also built the United States. So the United States, as a settler colony, was built on genocide and slavery. And now, with people who migrate there, either by choice because we want a better life, or not so much a choice when you're fleeing because you want safety, and then you come to the United States. Yeah, you came there, but you're forced by circumstances. But your relationship with the settler colony is expected to be one of gratitude. Be grateful, you get a better life, or be grateful, you get safety. And I'm deeply grateful for everything I have experienced on that land. No questions about it. However, my journey of migration has also been a journey of recognizing that my gratitude doesn't buy my silence. If there is injustice, there's injustice. My gratitude doesn't mean I won't name injustice. So then when I recognize my own history as third generation survivor of partition, my grandparents were freedom fighters. My grandfather in particular, I honor his name in this moment. Bhagat Ram Talwar was the man who escorted Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose across the border when he escaped from house arrest. And he supported Netaji in escaping through the terrain of Afghanistan and then helped him get to Russia. And then, Subhash Chandra Bose then, went on to Germany and gave the address in Berlin. So freedom, fighting colonizers was in my blood. It was already there. This awareness that the colonizer, no matter how benevolent, is at the heart of it, trying to erase you. India's own history of genocide at the hands of the British, famines at the hands of the British. You can look up studies that speak about how the famines we experienced actually continue to impact our health today. The kind of diabetes rates that exist in South Asian communities and the higher risks of cardiovascular disease is because of our histories of famine. So my whole understanding was also that I was now going to this new country, not completely cognizant of how my colonization experiences would speak out. And Pawani and I, when we had spoken a bit about, what angles I would take. So I might be jumping the gun here. So Pawani, if you've not asked this question, if I could just go into also, like, I think how the colonization then played out in my life there in the US. I think sometimes it was just something as basic as I would say my name is Gitika Talwar, and people would be like, "It's what?" And then I would say it, and then they would see it written, and they will be like, "Oh, so it's Gitika Talwar." And so I started saying my name like that, thinking it would become easier for people to understand my name. So I was like, "It's Gitika Talwar." And they were like, "Okay." And then at some point it hit me, "Hey, you know what? That's not my name. My name is Gitika Talwar. Learn to say it." And Gitika, it's like Ithaka with a G, Gitika Talwar. So that difference, and I do want to thank the speakers at a previous talk of this Truth and Reconciliation Summit. Uh, you know, uh, 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 it was a talk about the difficulty of being dharmic, and just that recognition of the small ways in which the colonizer left our land, but left a part of himself with me by saying I needed to make myself palatable. If I needed something from people, like the time my roommate didn't come home for 2 days and I had no idea where he was, and I wondered if he was dead and whether I was supposed to do something. And then he was like, "Oh no, I just gone out with friends." And I remembered having that moment of like, "Oh, I'm so sensitive. It's okay, people don't have to tell people where they're going." And I'm like, I thought it's like basic courtesy. We live in this house together. Like, let me know if you're not going to be home. It's just the two of us. Like, how difficult is that? And it's basic courtesy. If I would cook something, I would just ask, "Hey, would you like to eat?" It wasn't a big deal. He doesn't have to eat. But to me, it was just basic courtesy. It's not strange. That's just me. But I realized the small ways in which I would have this sense of deference if I didn't understand something. I felt like it was my lack that was the problem. I can't understand something, not that something else is kind of ridiculous. And also, like, I noticed the ways in which I wondered if the white man knew better, or the subtle ways in which I would, when we are doing study sessions together, if my peers didn't accept the answer I offered and they would wait for someone else to give the answer, I remember just thinking, that's kind of odd. Why wouldn't it be the right answer when I give it? Why do you have to wait for confirmation by another white peer? And realizing the subtle ways in which my nervous system was always tracking. And I remember even living in India, I would feel aware of if anything is said about Indians, or how an Indian person, like, I mean, it's happening even now, right? Like, some random Indian person will do something random in the United States, something really stupid. And people will be like, "Oh God, he's destroying it for the rest of us." Why? Why is he destroying it for the rest of us? I don't speak for a billion people. If one random American does something crazy, I don't think like, "Oh, all these Americans." No. So I think there was this, I was realizing how much, like, even in India, I carried this ambassador uh, stress, and it just heightened in the United States. I was representing a nation. No, I was a person trying to live my life. And somewhere, like, the colonization experience, also I started realizing was playing out in the form of, again, be grateful for what this nation is doing. Don't question it. So yeah. So I wonder about, I don't know how that's landing. I know that was a lot. I'm just wondering how that's landing, mind, body, spirit.
Thank you for uh, everything that you said, Gitika. And there were a few things that resonated very deeply with me. You know, when you said my gratitude doesn't have to meet my silence or my tolerance for other injustices, and both can coexist. And when you say that as an immigrant, I don't need to carry the burden of an entire nation because I am not going to represent a billion people, you know. And I feel very similar, although this is a little off the conversation, but you know, when we're working with women, and I run an organization where we train women to drive, and we come across these memes, right, where there would be one woman who probably falls or something, and then you end up saying, oh, no woman knows how to drive. So that's I think this form of generalizing is a very standard formula in othering people, and sort of creating bias by a majoritarian community, um, and exists for every form of community, whether it's gender, whether it's caste. Unfortunate, um, but it does exist. And I'm also wondering how, you know, there are two battles that you're fighting from this conversation, that everything that you just said. What I could think of is that there are two internal battles, and even external for that matter, that you're fighting. One is, especially when you are aware you are in a process of decolonizing yourself, right, internally as an Indian. um, and when you're in a new country, you're also building your identity as an immigrant. So at one point, you're trying to let go of an identity that has been formed as a result of colonization. And on the other, you're trying to build a new community, new identity, which is um, which is not carrying the burden of representing an entire nation, which is not, um, but which is also inclusive, you know, which does not, in a new community, does not completely other you or put you outside the community. So it's like discovering yourself, discovering a new identity completely. How do you sort of take both of these hand in hand?
I think that's where the decolonizing myself work was really helpful. That I had to recognize that, even as I don't represent a billion people, uh, the history, the ancestors, the multiple layers of influences uh, in India, they all impact me. So I am a manifestation of history. I hold privilege and I hold oppression based on my various identities. I hold privilege and oppression in the Indian context, in the South Asian context, and then in the US context. So, somewhere it was also like building one identity that could include all of this. So, how do I ensure that when I say I'm like a child of this universe, I don't say that to like bypass, I am not this, I'm not that, I'm not that religion, I'm not that caste, I'm not that socioeconomic status. It is, I am all of that, and I am much more than that. So it was a lot of recognizing that I needed to decolonize myself. And I think also, like I don't want to like define, and for this, I would really thank Sonali Madhireddy, and I hope I've said this right. So, we were having a conversation earlier, and it was really helpful to, I think, ground it in this awareness that we need to really define decolonization too, because in every different context, decolonization's nuances differ. Like decolonization is an ocean, but there are many rivers that go into it. So I was building an identity, but also decolonizing myself in the Indian South Asian context and also the US context by recognizing that, hey, there are a lot of privileges and identities that go into like an Indian South Asian identity, you know, privileges that come from be it caste, be it socioeconomic status. And socioeconomic status, of course, includes wealth and education, urban-rural divide, religion, which religion are you? And also what access to power do you have? So somewhere it was also like realizing that even in the US context, I might have like, the racial identity as a woman of color, but I was also um, building this identity of someone who had a PhD. So I had like a lot of like clout because of that. Like if people know I have a PhD, that there is like some deference that comes. And also how I found myself sometimes playing the game that if I walk into a room and announce that I have a PhD, people will take me seriously. So in moments that I was feeling small, like people won't take me seriously, I'm the only woman of color in this room, I noticed how much I would try to use my PhD like a weapon. I have a PhD. And not like I would say it like that, but like I would like put my title there or whatever. And I realized part of decolonizing myself was also going like, it doesn't have to be a weapon. My PhD has given me the opportunity to serve and do the work I absolutely love doing. I don't have to play this game of if you operate in hierarchies, I have a hierarchical card to show you. It's like I like kind of disconnected from that. And I also like started really deeply recognizing that as an immigrant to the United States, if you know people who've migrated to the US, you will hear them talk a lot about visa stuff. I went on first a student visa, the F1 visa, and then I got on to a dependent visa, with my partner, and then I went on my H1B visa, and then I went on like green card, and there's all this immigration paperwork stuff that really defines your life a lot in the United States, because if you are there, whether you have papers or you don't have papers, that really, really impacts the trajectory of your life. So at some point, I had to build an identity as a person that was beyond this. Paperwork will not define me. For example, during the pandemic, when my visa delays took place and I was forced out of work, I couldn't work for 9 months at the height of the pandemic. They're talking about a mental health pandemic. And I am forced out of work because my visa renewals had gotten delayed. And I remembered suddenly feeling like I don't matter. I have a PhD and I work. I have served this nation, but it doesn't matter. And I remembered feeling so small. And I used to go for these long walks. And I remembered once standing at the, before I go there, actually, I used to go on these long walks. And it was also during this period that I joined a meditation group. And this meditation group was in the lineage of Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh, and is in the lineage of Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh. And in this meditation group, I met an indigenous elder who I would love to name as I rest on this land, Dr. Shirin Shiu Thornton. And on like some of my first visits with this meditation group, she happened to do a practice where we were touching the earth. And we were basically like bowing to the earth and all our ancestors on this lands all over. And I remembered it was in the experience of that practice that Dr. Shirin Shiu Thornton sort of introduced us to this whole idea of the land does not belong to people, people belong to the land. And that this land loves you. And I think that really stayed with me, that the land loves me. My visa paperwork does not tell me anything about my belonging. The land loves me. And I wanted to make a relationship with the land and who made this land, who took care of this land. And So I went on these long walks, and I remember I was, of course, pretty depressed because I wasn't working. And my identity with work is like a whole other colonizing talk. But I remember then there was this one point where I could see the ocean, I could see the mountains, and I could see the sky. And I remember thinking, like, no matter what happens to my visa and whether I get asked to leave the country because my visa is like gone, I was like, I will always belong to these mountains, to the sky, to this land. A visa will not decide my belonging. It's paperwork. Man makes all sorts of nonsense. But the ancestors of this land, I pay my homage to them. I pay my respects to them. And it was in that time that I also wrote a piece, which I didn't publish, but it was just about that as immigrants, we migrate to uh, many nations. The US being the one I can speak to because I migrated there. But I was like, when we migrate, we build a relationship with the government systems. But governments are not people. People are people. So building a relationship with people, and that I realized that I had acknowledged the authority of the immigration system, but I was like, but bigger than the authority of that immigration system to me is the moral and spiritual authority of the ancestors who built that land. Former slaves and their descendants and the indigenous ancestors who were stewarded this land long before Columbus pretends to have found something. He didn't find anything. He just was like doing whatever he was doing. He was so somewhere realizing that I bear my respects to them and I want to do what is right by them. So somewhere the identity for me was also realizing that I did not have to, and this is true for immigrants in general, because, there's this hard work ethic, work hard, you'll get whatever you want. And if you're not making it in the US, it's because you're not working hard enough. Like that very individualistic, extractive model of whatever, completely disregarding indigenous and genocide, slavery, and how much like wealth was built from extraction. So when immigrants come in and then are told, just work hard and be grateful, don't complain, you're recruited into the settler colonial system that makes you think you are failing because you're not working hard enough. So immigrants are expected to, and we kind of buy it. And that's where our former colonization also plays an impact, right? That the authority of the colonizer is now transferred to the authority of the settler colonizer who holds your immigration paperwork. So you end up working really hard, and then the colonial tactic of divide and conquer, pitting immigrant groups against each other. If you're not successful as an immigrant, look at those other immigrants. They're doing well. What's the problem? Or as people of color or Black indigenous people of color, dividing the community again, saying, look at these immigrants. They come and do well. What's your problem? You've lived here long before the immigrants did. Well, former slaves, descendants of slaves, no money. And then you're relying on the indentured servitude of immigrants, because a lot of the work that if you want to work in the United States, that's also a whole other talk. You need to rely on some kind of like paperwork. And a lot of times you are kind of indentured into organizations if, if they have your paperwork. So I've always said that deep respect for the United States in many different ways. And also it's a nation that was built on genocide, on slavery, and it thrives on the indentured servitude of its immigrant communities. And as part of building my identity, I realized I also had to build an identity of not being recruited by settler colonial systems, but solidarity with all those who have built that nation and fought for civil rights in that nation. A lot of like immigration reform work happened because of the work of Black, Asian, indigenous civil rights leaders. I bear absolute loyalty to them. They are my moral and spiritual authorities. So building solidarity and not falling for that colonizer trick of if you're successful, make sure you're not like the other guy, because everyone else is, subject to some kind of like oppression. So not pitting oppressed people against each other. So I think that building my identity was also about channeling the rage that I had, the absolute rage I had about colonization. And I think the last thing that I will say, and that might also segue into, um, I know we wanted to talk about decolonizing and the mental health system, but like one thing I would want to say is, in the course of being an immigration activist in the US, I was working with the US Congress. I was talking to both sides of the US Congress aisle, like, the Democrats and the Republicans. I was kind of having to work with these all different members of Congress, and we were a big group that was working on immigration reform. And I remembered feeling like yoga and meditation and all of that has been brought into the United States and sold. But you want my practices, you don't want my people. Indians don't belong, but yoga and meditation does. So I remember that always stayed with me, that tells you everything you need to know about how the settler colony works. I'll breathe and let everyone breathe. Yeah. Thank you for the love. And yeah. And folks, please feel free to like switch on your cameras if you like, no pressure, of course. But please welcome to do that. Yeah.
Thank you for the courage, Gitika. I'm just thinking we all want to belong to the mountains and the rivers and the land and to people. But it is so much easy to say than to actually be able to do that, because you have to forgive and let go so much. And there's so much inner work that you have to do in order to actually be able to accept that. And the courage that you've shown to do that inner work it's infectious, it's inspiring, and really, we're I'm very inspired by the courage.
Yeah.
You know, actually, we have Kavita, Sonali, Lakshmi. Thank you for turning on your cameras. And actually, at this point, I would actually even like to ask you guys if you have any questions that you want to ask Gitika. We do want to talk about, because her expertise is in mental health practices and decolonizing them. We do want to talk about how can we decolonize mental health practices. But we would love to also get questions from you or any thoughts coming at this point that you'd like to share.
Yeah, thank you, Gitika. It was very touching listening to you. I was in touch with few thoughts about uh, how even staying from one state to the other. Like I've been traveling within India, but then it's an experience in itself. Just going, being there, and then suddenly in 3 years I have to shift somewhere. So I could resonate a lot of things that you are sharing, how to build identity there. And the ones who are closely with you, and then suddenly you have to be away from them and then move to another city. And it takes a lot of toll on your mental health as well. Right. So I was in touch with many things, but this stood out for me. Thought I should share it with you. And lovely listening to you. It was very touching. I'm also more of an earthy person, so I lived in Mumbai for some time, so I felt the earth took care of me because I used to ride in scooters there, but I've never even skidded there once. But I lived in Bangalore, I've skidded many times. So I've always felt very grateful that the earth, Mother Earth of Bombay have taken care of me so much. So I could connect with a lot of the nature and the belonging that you're sharing. So it stays with me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lakshmi. Thank you. And Achal, I see you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, hi, good evening. So, firstly, I love listening to you. Everything you said just hits a chord, multiple chords rather, if we're talking about like a multiplicity of identities. But so I recently graduated and I had a triple major in psychology, sociology, and English. And one of the papers that I had was post-colonial literatures, right? And the fact that I'm here and you're talking about a space that is so, I mean, at least for the modern Indian youth, is still quite quintessentially white, like a mental health space, a therapist's office is still a very white concept for a lot of people. And the fact that we speak about like decolonizing a space like that, right? So what you said really got me thinking, and it it's quite sad, but I'm also hopeful. But it just weighs down on you at one point when you realize that this is a lifelong process. I think that's what like I took from what you said, because a lot of decolonizing begins with recognizing that sort of um power imbalance, or this sort of like interpersonal space that you're in, and how it manifests in very like even non-verbal actions and behavior and gestures. And then the fact that it doesn't end there, right? Because you recognize that, but you also feel very helpless, and you're like, okay, but now I am in a place and I've fought tooth and nail to get here. I'm doing a master's program, I'm doing an MPhil, a PhD, whatever it is. And then you inherently feel like quietening down that sort of resistance that you inherently have. And I feel like that's what for me and a lot of my peers too is confusing, because we've been sort of educated in schooling systems that have always been like, no, Oxford English, and like Cambridge systems and small stuff like that, that you realize later on has affected the way you think and speak. And then now we're at this juncture where everyone's like, oh my god, if you want to make it big as a practitioner, you got to do this, and you got to settle here, and you got to go there. And then I just feel like, okay, what did I just learn in 3 years, So I think a lot of what you said, um everyone experiences it at all age groups, but not a lot of people are able to articulate that. And that's why I really enjoyed listening to you, because it's such a niche thing to even recognize that sort of influence on your practice and on the people that come to you. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Achal. And Kavita, I'll come to you. Uh, it's like this, we are trying to decolonize, and we're also like still subject to time and space. So, but I did want to name like 2, 3 things, and then Kavita, I'll just come to you. I think one thing that I definitely wanted to bring up is like, and again, thanks Sonali for like helping me anchor into that reality that there are a lot of values that go into decolonizing work. There are values that the colonial systems imposed on us. And my experience with the settler colony of the United States showed me that that's land that has been like usurped. But the British left this land, but they left themselves in our minds. So the value systems of scarcity, of competition, of hierarchies, and then of course the caste-based hierarchies that were also embedded long before the British came in. So the kind of, when you think about colonization, it's important to think beyond just, very important though, the Euro-American colonizers and the colonial power they still have over the mental health system. Important to name that for sure. But also know that that's not the only colonizing force. The colonizing force is anything, any dominant value system that imposes itself on people and denies the power of people who challenge it. So competition, extraction, coercion instead of collaboration, relationships, and also the interdependence that is a natural human experience. We will not survive without Mother Earth taking care of us. If we as human beings, we need to like do something about climate change because Mother Earth is going to be fine. It's the human race that's going to go extinct. So the thing is, like, Mother Earth is taking care of us, and Mother Earth knows how to like get rid of things that are not in sync. So somewhere the decolonizing work is recognizing what are the values that are influencing me. So I think, like a last thing that I will just say before, I come to Kavita, your question, or, whatever you want to share, is the important thing about remembering decolonizing mental health work is it's much more than multiculturalism. Much more than that. We can't have bad mental health practices just being done by Indians. It's like if a mental health value is individualistic, it's not allowing genuine healing, it's a bad mental health practice, doesn't matter who practices it. So I've always maintained that it's not enough to tell people, go seek mental health care. Oh, there's so much stigma. Remove the stigma of mental health and make people go to mental health practitioners. I'm like, no, if it's trashy mental health, forget it. Don't bother, because that's going to be like a whole other bag of chips. So for us to really decolonize mental health, we have to go way beyond multiculturalism. We need to like recognize, hey, what values are operating here? Are they allowing really restful, collaborative work, harmonious work, sustainable for the planet type of work? Or is it just European American nonsense? So for me, it was also realizing that I had to leave home to come home. I had to leave, go to the United States to feel a sense of connection. So it was absolutely, recognizing, through the mental health work I was doing there, that so many times I was working with Black Indigenous people of color who were first-time therapy users, and I was seeing how mental health work that I had done in India was helping me do the work there, because the work I was doing in India, I had done with traditional healing, with respect for traditional healing paradigms as well. So it was a lot of like the decolonizing work that I did in India that had helped me also serve communities that didn't feel served by mainstream mental health systems. So yeah, it was supposed to be a short thing that I said, but thank you so much, Aanchal, for what you were sharing, and I'm just so glad you're here, and keep the spirit going and all of that. So yes, Kavita, you had like something you had want to share.
Namaste. Oh my goodness, I'm so honored to have entered this space. I feel that I'm in the company of absolute soul sisters. And thank you so much for bringing this conversation into the world, because I don't know where to begin in terms of how many layers and layers of this has resonated for me. So myself being from, my roots are Indian. My forefathers migrated from India to Guyana in South America. I come from a Hindu Brahmin Pujari family that was very instrumental in maintaining this culture. And in many ways, we retain the culture in spite of the massive push to colonialize in order to become, gainfully employed and things like that. And if you see my name, it's not a misspelling. Let me just get that out of the way. It is a colonial mishap. So when my family immigrated to Canada, somebody didn't know how to spell Kavita, and it became on my administrative document spelled with a C. And I went deeply into this. It's been a lifelong conversation. I'm completely sick of it. So now when I go into communication with Desis, I'll just like get that out of the way, because I came to understand in this beautiful culture, it's not about the spelling, it's about the sound. Ka was what mattered. So the ka is present regardless of the spelling. And I really leaned into this because I have a bit of a creative spirit. And a lot of what I recognize and what I'm involved with is, over 25 years in social work and mental health as well. But I've completely disentangled myself from wanting to be a part of the system that is just offering up services that is not really supporting well-being. So and also I had to jot down your words when you said this about channeling and working in a way that really recognizes that we may not be a part of the system or the practice, but that the people are the practice. And I feel like I've been in Canada for over 45 years. So this is very much what I know. But I still don't feel like I quote unquote belong, in the sense that if there was a special occasion, if it wasn't acceptable from a colonial perspective, it just wasn't given priority. And I had to play to that tune for a very, very long time. And then a few years ago, I've been involved with the Save Soul movement, very much leaned into the power of Prithvi, the earth, and really wanting to bring this conversation forward for our community. And I saw that here in my community, they had scheduled municipal elections on Diwali Day. And somehow I felt unacceptable to raise this as a conversation. And so, instead of lighting our diyas, we had to go to the polling stations. So the colonial aspect is very much in my awareness. But I really, the reason I'm very touched by this conversation is because I know I'm sitting with a group of people that are very much, from listening to you, Gitika, I feel so reassured that it's very much, we're trying to shift this to the level that is like very warm and supportive, and not just thrusting in a hostile and violent way that, that these things need to, be forcibly changed. But because of who we are and our willingness to bring forward these conversations a little bit more, I think it's going to have a huge impact. And I just wanted to say how grateful I am for Pawani and yourself and the other people on this group for having this conversation. There's so much more to say, but I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kavita. Thank you. Yeah. And I think like one thing that definitely comes to mind that I definitely wanted to say also about decolonizing mental health is about one of the sad things that Euro-American mental health systems do, things in particular that I would want to name that I have major critiques of, is the absence of spirituality and faith in integrating that in mental health. That people have a relationship with the transcendental. They have a relationship with something that's bigger than them. So the importance of a mental health practice that recognizes the multiplicity of our faith identities. And which is why like decolonizing Indian mental health would also look at how can the Indian mental health scene be influenced by the number of faiths in the South Asian context. So Indian mental health shouldn't just become code for Hindu mental health. It has to be like a multi-faith experience. And in general, mental health all over the world, how do we integrate spirituality and people's faith into the work? And the other thing is the focus on the individual self is a problem. Like we need to recognize the importance of focusing on the interdependent self. We are nothing in isolation. We were built by our ancestors. We are built by our hopes for our future generations, whether we have our own children or not. So recognizing that we are constantly in relationship with something much bigger than us, the earth, the ancestors, the future generations. So definitely wanted to name that. And I am aware of the time. So how are we doing, Pawani?
We're doing perfectly well, and we're going with the flow. I think while you were also answering to Achal, we also spoke about some aspects of decolonizing mental health practices. And if you'd like to touch further on that, dive deeper into that, we can do that.
Sure. Yeah. How much time do we have?
So we're at 9:26, and we can speak for another 10 minutes, I think.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I definitely wanted to bring up is, and this is true in the context of immigration, as well as people who may have migrated within their own nations, not migrated across international borders. And also, please remember how borders are a colonial construct. You know, so that's another talk. But so the thing is, in immigrant mental health experiences, when I'm just offering a talk about immigrant mental health and to US-based mental health professionals, I talk about these forms of acculturation. Acculturation being the relationship that you have with the culture of your country of origin. So I don't say home country, I don't say host country, because sometimes literature has talked about the country you migrate to is the host, which what makes you the guest. And I'm like, that's problematic. And also, home country assumes that people can't have multiple homes. So I'm very intentional about saying culture of the country of origin and culture of the country of migration. So when you migrate, the cultures that you are in, holding, you could either, for your acculturation, you could either assimilate completely adopt the culture of the country of migration, or you could become bicultural, have some aspects of the culture of the country of origin, some aspects of the culture of the country of migration. You could also have separation, which could be you don't incorporate the culture of the country of migration. You only hold on to the culture you've known. And then the final one is marginalization, where you are like, I don't belong to either cultures. I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to find a community that identifies with a whole other culture that has nothing to do with countries. So people could have the culture of like video game culture or whatever, So in a mental health context, for immigrant mental health purposes, I often, in the decolonial context, I talk about how are we making mental health spaces a space for healing and not acculturation. So the cultural values of the therapist or the practitioner, if those cultural values are also influenced by Euro-American mental health values, you are going to be forcing your client to define their wellness in terms of those values. For example, people who are really attached to their families, and they're like, I have to integrate my family's opinions into, sorry. I don't know which phone is ringing. Okay. So people who are trying to incorporate their family's opinions in their, let's say, life choices, that's not a pathology. That is how families operate. However, if there is coercion taking place and the person's own aspirations are being disregarded, again, that's not a cultural thing. That's a toxicity thing. That's a problem. So the culture is not the problem. The family's inability to listen to each other is the problem. And when we talk about the interdependent self, we are recognizing that the unhappiness of one is going to radiate into the unhappiness of the other. The family will be unhappy if one member is unhappy. So it is somewhere putting the person in touch with the reality that if you're unhappy, could your family actually be happy? So you're saying you'll just do what your parents are telling you to do, but is that happiness? So the problem is not that you're listening to your parents. The concern is that you think they will be happy even if you're unhappy. Can we talk about that? So it is, it's not pathologizing the importance of family. It is bringing up, how are you assuming that you're so separate from your family that you think your unhappiness won't affect them? So somewhere I have often spoken about in immigration context that how are you actually expressing welcome and a non-judgmental curiosity for how this person is creating their world? And how are you acknowledging the impact of history, the person's personal history, family history, the community's history? How are you incorporating the influence of that history on this person's uh, values, experiences, and all of that? So, which is why I'd really appreciated like the earlier talk. So, if folks can actually go even listen to that other talk of the difficulty of being dharmic. One of the things was like also, naming how colonial trauma or just trauma in general, how you start responding because of trauma in a particular way and then start thinking that's my personality or that's my culture. And it's like, oh, when do you distinguish between a trauma response and culture? So decolonizing mental health is also about recognizing, and decolonizing mental health for immigrant communities is about honoring people's traditions, culture, historic influences, and ensuring that the therapist doesn't become the ambassador for, like in my context, it was like that the therapist shouldn't become another ambassador for US culture. This is how you survive in the US, especially when so much of survival in the US needs to actually integrate solidarity with BIPOC movements. So I'm like, how, as a therapist, are you supporting this client in truly honoring their humanity? And especially if people have migrated for the sake of work or something like that, their identity could be influenced by work so much. And that can very easily end up seeming like very hardworking, good work ethic. No, if your work ethic is harming your health, can we talk about that? But can we talk about that with a sense of empathy and compassion for how much this immigrant person has been reinforced for being hardworking at the cost of their family, of their health, and all of that? So it is somewhere of the naming what are the systems communicating to this immigrant person about gratitude, about if you don't do it, nobody's going to come do it for you. And for immigrants in particular, a lot of whom are dislocated from their families and resource systems, it can be really challenging to live a life where you genuinely continue to believe that if I don't do it, nobody will do it for me because there's nobody else in this country who's going to take care of me. So in the mental health context, it has been very important to ensure that mental health spaces didn't become a site for, again, perpetuating cultural values or like assimilation. And like one thing I always remember a client once said to me was like, every time people try to correct my accent or correct my English, I feel like they're asking me to colonize myself or they won't speak to me. And I that's always stayed with me, because like I say psychology, but I used to say I think I used to say psychology before. But then I learned to say psychology and now I can't stop saying it. Like I've forgotten how I used to say it. But I had to say it in a particular way to make myself palatable. So there are small ways I've colonized myself. But now that I call myself Gitika Talwar and I break into Hindi every now and then, not assuming that all Indians speak Hindi, of course, but that I break into my own language now and then, I am learning like, hey, I don't have to like erase myself to be palatable. So also therapy, how can it be an opportunity for immigrants to uh, feel welcomed with their ancestral wisdom, with their culture, with their needs, and seen for it, not pathologized for it. So yeah, that's what comes to mind. Yeah.
Take a deep breath for all of us to just process everything that has been shared in today's session. At some level, it resonates with all of us in our experiences, in our journey towards healing, towards creating that awareness for ourselves, towards building the kind of courage it needs to accept it, to reconcile these two identities at times. So with that, I think we can conclude our session for today. It was pleasure to have you talk on this topic, and I think it was pure synchronicity how this session even happened through a LinkedIn post that you shared, and simply reaching out and saying, hey, we really like what you're talking about on LinkedIn, and we think that this needs to be a larger dialogue. It needs to be a deeper conversation. And here we are 2 months later. So thank you once again. And thank you everybody for joining. You can all get in touch with Gitika on LinkedIn if you want. And all these conversations are going up on our YouTube channel of Shakti Leadership. So you can just search for Shakti Leadership. And we have a Truth and Reconciliation Dialogues 2024 playlist. There are some more sessions that have happened previous to this. There are a few more upcoming sessions. These sessions happen every year around Guru Purnima,
Nice.
primarily focused on healing and leading. So yeah, please, we would love to have you engage with more sessions in the upcoming days too. And thank you so much. Good night, or good morning.
Welcome to my world also, Pawani. Both of us now in the same world, speaking across time zones. Hello, everyone. Have a good whatever it is.
So yes, have a good whatever it is. Make the best out of it and take care.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.